Hey everyone, welcome to the 19th episode of the Coffee with Cosmos DB series. If you have missed to join the last episode, you can watch the recording, which is under the playlist Coffee with Cosmos DB series on the left hand side of the channel. Before I kickstart the today's episode, today we have Microsoft Ignite. You should absolutely watch the keynote where you would be able to find out the latest announcement and also including the Cosmos DB announcements. Make sure you don't miss it. If you're joining this live session for the first time, this series is all about spreading the knowledge on Cosmos DB. It's by experts of the community, and if you're a community member, feel free to join this forum in order to talk about anything on Cosmos DB. Please make sure to subscribe the channel and share with the community members who are looking to learn more about Azure Cosmos DB. With that, let me introduce our guest for today. Today we have a special guest, someone from the community joining first time in this forum. Let me add him. Hey Abhijit.
Hey Sajidharan, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing well. How about you?
I'm doing great.
It's great to have you because you are the first one from the community to talk about, Azure Cosmos DB and one of the features on it. So feel free to introduce yourself.
So, hello everyone, I'm Abhijit Ganesh. I'm now a third year student from VIT Chennai, a pre final year to be precise. So, here I'm going to talk about how we can use Azure Cosmos DB as an alternative to the free and open source software called Supabase. So, let's get started.
Yeah, I guess today you're going to talk about Data API Builder, which is one of the latest features that we worked on Azure side for all databases, which lets the developers to quickly spin up GraphQL and also REST endpoints on all databases, including Cosmos DB. Yeah, I will hand it over to you. Take it forward. Go ahead.
Yeah, I hope my screen is visible.
Yep. Let me. Yep.
Yeah, so firstly, thanks to Sajidharan's team for making Data API Builder a reality because it helps us a lot when it comes to making accessing databases easily. I know there have been versions like Postgres and other open source tools which make life easier, but I think Data API Builder brings something extremely unique to the community because you can run it as a container, and that's what this whole talk is going to be, right? So let's get started with Supabase first. Now, this is my favorite tool when it comes to making a front end app without the worry of running the backend, right? So, obviously, all of us know there is support for authentication, storage, and obviously, you can access the database here. And also, there is some support for GraphQL. You need to go somewhere deep in the bottom to find it. I went to the wrong place. Sorry. API GraphQL should be here. API docs. So you can see GraphQL is here. Now, this is a very recent addition of Supabase, and the problem here we see here is it's pretty complex in its own way. So Supabase runs a set of containers in the cloud platform which we choose to. So this project is running on Mumbai AWS, right? That's the default configuration for India. Now, let's say you have a situation where you have a pre-existing database, you want to make a modern front end without affecting the entire ecosystem. So you will resort to something like Postgres, right? Oops. Yeah. You will resort to something like Postgres, right? Now, what if you had to do GraphQL? Again, you would have to bring in more sophistication. So let's see what it takes to self-host Supabase first. So for someone to self-host this via Docker, this is the compose file, right? I'll walk through this briefly so that we have some context, right? So this is the starting command which they've given. It's pretty obvious. We are not going to understand how Docker is going to work. But the idea here is they have a list of services, right? Studio, the Kong, Auth is the. Oh, see, the key idea is Supabase is an all-in-one backend. It allows you to do authentication, it allows you to do file storage, it allows you to do database querying. Now, how does Data API Builder make our life easy? See, all these services here are linked crisscross, or you have to put in a lot of effort understanding how these are defined. You need to put more man hours understanding how to deploy them. You need to have your own deployment strategy. And if you have Kubernetes, you need to figure out how you're going to fit all of these into a Kubernetes manifest. Though there should be some option here, But this is the Docker way of doing things, right? If you're containerizing Supabase and then self-hosting it, it involves a lot of man hours. Now let us compare this against the Docker Compose file I wrote for this project, right? This is a blog project. It's still work in progress and not fully done. So you can't technically sign in and it won't go through. And there's also a link, but it's not fully ready. Now, the whole pro- process here is I have a Postgres, dummy credentials container which is running. Now this is ready. It runs on port 5432, and all it took me was to mention this one service for Data API Builder. It's barely 10 lines of code, and it got the entire GraphQL endpoint set up for me. Right now, I am a big believer of GraphQL over REST because it makes my life easier when I'm querying and mutating data. But obviously, there are situations where you might need REST because let's say you have backend two, which queries data from backend one. You might need REST there, though you could use Postgres, sorry, you could use GraphQL there too. Let's say you don't want to complicate it and you want to use REST, you can also use REST. So in Supabase, to define GraphQL, it's a separate service. It's another headache because it involves a lot of deployment efforts. Whereas here, it's just one endpoint. So if I go here to REST, it should work. Though in a browser, it won't reflect properly. See, it says bad request, of course. So I have set up the data API builder locally in my PC with exactly with exactly this configuration. So I have a Postgres server running, uh, and I have a data API builder running. So this is what I have. Now in this data API builder service, I have defined a list of features. So before we go into querying, there's an important part which we all need to understand, right? So data API builder sounds cool and it now is a good competition to Supabase when it comes to self-hosting. But then how do we get started and how do we configure this, right? So for this, I'll be going to VS Code for a bit. So let me close all of this and let me explain what dap config is, right? So this is the config JSON file, which is like your YAML file for the dab, right? So for running the data API builder, I'll be referring to that as dab. Yeah, so I have installed it, so it's pretty easy for me to run it now. So I can just put dap start. But the thing here is this will pick up this config while inside my database I'm using this PostgreSQL config. Okay, so there are a set of thumb rules. Let's talk about them first. So when you're making a dap JSON file, make sure that you name them with
Vijit,
the,
one request, if you can zoom out a
yeah.
bit, that would be, it's fine. Yep.
So your thumb rule here is to make sure that you have a config file and then you have the database type or name and then .json. That's your first thumb rule. Now for this, I think Microsoft themselves have come up with this utility called Data API CLI. Am I mentioning the right name or is it something else? There's a helper which I saw here.
Yeah, it's a dap CLI. So, yeah.
Yeah. So the dApp CLI helps you with this. So I took a lot of references from this part of it. So for anyone who's starting up with dab, the first thing you have to do is to get .NET installed and then go to the dab CLI. There will be a lot of help given there itself. And when you do init, so init is the process where you configure the entire flow. And then once you have the JSON configured, it's ready to go, right? So dab init help, you will see all the options that are available. So the database type here is Postgres that I've used. You can also use Cosmos DB Postgres and Cosmos NoSQL. So Jitin, a quick question here.
Yep.
Uh, how exactly does like Cosmos NoSQL work with that? Because all of them are SQL options, but Cosmos DB NoSQL alone is a NoSQL option. No, it's quite astonishing for me to see how it supports both. Like, can you give us a brief idea about it?
That's right. So when it comes to Cosmos DB, our core API is the NoSQL API, right? So when you talk about storing, NoSQL data, especially in the form of document, and if you want to query the document, uh, basically the graphical adoption is mostly among the NoSQL databases. So one of the reason we added Cosmos DB NoSQL is to support those scenarios. So in this case, you can expose that particular document or which is embedded in a container as a graphical endpoint. So I hope that
Right.
clarified. Yeah, yeah,
So, like, there are other SQL platforms, or I don't want to call them databases as such because they're built on top of MySQL or Postgres, right? You
yep,
have Influx, not Influx. You have Timescale, which is a time series database, which is built on top of Postgres.
yep.
So, when I'm using DAB on such databases, will I be able to fully use it? Is there a
No, currently
possibility
it's
of?
only the Microsoft Azure databases supported, the ones that you see on the database type, right? It's
Yeah.
basically SQL, MySQL, and then
No, but I'm
yeah,
asking if I have a database which is built on top of Postgres, which is
yeah,
like
it
fully
should be
Postgres,
fairly
but
supported.
it
Yeah,
should
you
be,
can.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was one question. And apart from this, another question is, when are we getting real time with Cosmos? Because that is the major, one of the biggest advantages of Supabase, right? Now, the disadvantage of Supabase is what we just saw. And we are kind of missing out real time here. So, how are we going to go with real time data?
So when it comes to GraphQL, I think one of the major features is subscription, right? Um,
Hmm.
we have in the roadmap to add subscription feature, basically for having like client to server communication, so that whenever the data gets updated, you will be able to see it on the client. Especially on the Cosmos DB, we do have something called as change feed, which does similar like. For example, like if you're doing a notification, then you can use change feed on top of Cosmos DB to notify the uh, the client using Azure Function. So that is one combination that you can use. But with DAB, right now the plan is to enable the real time using subscriptions, which is in the roadmap. Yeah. But
Right.
if you're
No, because
using
as a
Cosmos
community
DB,
member,
yeah, go ahead.
that was the biggest feature I was looking for it.
Yeah, definitely that's in the roadmap. I think even if you go to the database builder feature ask, you can see like subscription being asked most of the time. So it's in the roadmap. Probably by we will have it by next year, Q1 or Q2. Yeah,
Right. Now, another interesting question. I mean, I'm trying to make this interactive so that we have
yeah,
a nice flow here.
yeah,
So, I think Microsoft really recently came up with Entra, which, am I saying it right?
yeah,
Entra,
yeah. Entra.
Entra, the
Yeah, yeah,
authentication.
that's right. Yeah, Entra ID.
Yeah. So, does the auth provider thing also support Entra ID?
No,
Or am
here
I
the it's
misunderstanding
just
this
a
bit?
no. We do have this Azure Active Directory, right? Which is
Yeah.
basically the authentication provider for all Azure services. It's just
Hmm.
a renaming of the service. Like we used to call it as AAD. Right now, it's called as Intra ID. So it's just the renaming of the existing service. The feature remains the same. Yeah,
Right. Okay.
yeah.
So it's pretty much the same. I was under the assumption that Entra is a new replacement as such. So
No, no,
whether DAB would be able to.
no. Yeah,
Right. So we have seen a bit about DAB now. Now let's go back to the hands-on dev part here.
sure.
Now, once you're here, there is a major thing which most developers forget to do. Even I forget to do it. So you need to configure CORS, or cross origin request scheme, when you're running a container dab, right? So the thing here is, if you don't configure CORS, you will end up with an error like this. It'll say fail to fetch. I haven't configured CORS here. So if I refresh this, you'll be able to see why it's not working, because I haven't configured CORS for the response. It says here, you can see it. Is it too small? Can I zoom it in? Yeah, this should be okay, right?
Yep. No, can see.
Right. So there's a lot of inbuilt functionality, though CORS is something which is essential for any backend app. You would have CORS error if you don't configure it. So please do configure it before using it. I particularly didn't configure it just to make this as an example. Now, once you're done with that, you are good to go in terms of running the database, right? Now, another important part, we have configured it somewhat. We have configured CORS, but how do we add our tables, right? Our tables in DAB language is called as entities, right? So here, if you see, I have configured all my entities here. I have book, I have publisher, and those are the two entities I have for this. I've taken this example quite literally from the um, configuration code that is available on GitHub. It was quite useful because it's not easy to generate fake data. Now, so I have to configure the table inside the database first. So if you already have a pre-configured database, you need to ensure that all your entities are added. Otherwise, it's not going to allow you to access this uh, database as such, sorry, the table as such, right? If you don't access the table, there is no point having this GraphQL endpoint. So you need to have that enabled. And once you've done that, you can also decide whether it needs to be only REST, only GraphQL, and so on. So let's say I'm disabling enabled here for REST for books alone. Now let's go back to the GraphQL part. Now, is my screen visible with the GraphQL? Should I increase the font size or something?
Yeah, I can see it, but it's better if you can increase the font size, like zoom out. Yeah.
Yeah, so once you have done that, you can query and mutate. So the first thing here is I have added the entities for books. I have inserted some data there, and I've also made the entity called publishers inside my database. I'll show the SQL version of it soon. So if I do execute this GraphQL command, it's going to work just like any other GraphQL API easily. You can query for exactly what you need. Also, GraphQL has its own advantages, right? Most of us know how it helps us with overfetching. GraphQL cuts it down. It makes the life of both backend and front end engineers easy and all of that. Now, once you've defined this, you can always look up to the schema definition and reference. So here you can reference all the available functions. There's a small, you know, missing here, which I think Sajidharan mentioned in the pre-call. So these two are supposed to be relational entities, but they're not actually related. So when you have related entities in GraphQL, you first have this infinite loop kind of thing where you can query for items. Inside that, you can find publishers. Inside publishers, you can reverse map to books. You might have that infinity loop kind of a situation where you have all the data. But the thing is this, right? Currently, DAB doesn't support uh, multi-table queries. He called it multi-container queries. I think that is something which we are working towards as a community as such. Another thing, I think DAB also supports more open source PRs, right? Am I right, Sridharan, about it?
Yeah, yeah. It's open source depo, so anyone who wants to contribute, you can take up some of the features.
I
Yeah.
genuinely wish if it wasn't in C sharp though. It's, it's something which I didn't know, so I'm still figuring out how to contribute to this.
Oh, so
Yeah,
you must be a TypeScript fan? Oh,
yeah, I'm a big TypeScript, Python, Rust.
got it. Okay.
Yeah, so speaking of C sharp, quick question. So, have you ever benchmarked DAB against any other similar, like, you have other GraphQL which runs on top of Postgres or MySQL, right? Or even
That's right.
MS SQL. Have you ever
So
benchmarked it?
currently, this particular offering, like Data API Builder for Azure databases, it's in preview, right? So any service on Azure which is in preview, we don't recommend customers to use it in production unless we made it generally available. Uh, so the guidance here is we do have some metrics enabled, which uses the latest version of DAB. So what we do is in our pipelines, we do some test runs that generate some report, like how much, but that's again particular scenario, right? So for example, if you're using books and authors, it's basically two containers. So, but in the case of real customer scenarios, it might be with multiple entities with different document size. So in order to match those benchmarks, currently we don't have a way to automatically generate with a particular data, but it's kind of the setup we have is kind of basic, but certainly that's also in the roadmap because the customers who would be using other providers, they would be looking at how DApp performs. So that's something that we are working on.
Since this whole talk was about how DAB is a replacement to Supabase,
Yeah,
I have this interesting question. It might sound like a proposal also. So, you know about the Azure Data Factory, data lakes,
that's
and
right.
all
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
entire data
Mm.
engineering ecosystem they have, right? Now, Azure doesn't technically have a backend as a service offering. It has DAB, it has containers for you running whatever exact service you want, but it doesn't have a managed backend as a service. Now,
That's right.
with the
Yeah.
entry of DAB, and then you have Azure SQL, and then you have AAD, and now it's called Entra, right? So all
Mm-mm.
these three put together, will we have something like a backend as a service in any time soon? Because that makes a whole different picture, right?
That's a valid point. I think when you compare with competitive, especially with other providers, right? Certainly, you can think of Firebase and AppSync. All these providers, they have BAS solutions. So definitely, DAB is a starting point for that. Uh, we are working on making improvements by collaborating with other teams. So you will see something soon, but we don't have a ETA as of now.
Right. No, because
Yeah,
that's an
yeah,
interesting question slash proposal I have, because
yeah.
when you talk about having a BaaS offering, it's a whole different life cycle for a front end developer, right?
That's right. Yeah,
Talking about BaaS as an offering, right? So I think that is something which I've been looking for. Now, apart from this, uh, I'd like to try running this on Azure, not for this demo, but soon enough, I'll make a full separate video on how to run this entire setup on Azure. Though you're free to run this Docker Compose on Azure, it should work. As a Azure App Service or Azure Managed Containers. I'm not sure about the exact service, but I'm going to try running this on Azure as such. And then I'll
yeah,
finish up with this blog and then deploy it and send you a link as a blog probably.
yeah,
So I'll try writing a blog about how I made this blog site using DAB and send it to you. I think that's about it from my end.
yeah. Sure. I think the demo that you showed, you can add it to our samples repo for the data IP builder. So in the main repo, we do have a link for the samples, right? So if you're thinking of building a cool sample, please create a PR so that we can have it as a sample under the data IP builder sample. Um, yeah, I think it was an interesting one. Thanks for sharing all the insights and also with the demo. I hope the audience were able to get an understanding about how DApp works and also how easy it is to build a graphical endpoint on top of Azure databases. Do you have anything else, Abhijit? Any question or any feedback?
No, I'm actually extremely grateful for this opportunity. I'm sorry there was a bit of a technical snag. That's why I had to wrap this up a bit earlier. But I'm extremely grateful for this opportunity to be featured on Coffee with Cosmos DB. And
Yep.
personally, I haven't used the NoSQL version of Cosmos DB, so I'll be really excited to use that soon. And
Yep.
hopefully, I'll be making more content around Azure Cosmos itself. And
Yep.
I'll be trying to upload that in my own YouTube channel. It'll come up on my LinkedIn. So all of you are requested to follow my LinkedIn. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for joining again, and thanks for joining audience who are watching it live. We will keep this recorded as well. So if you want to watch this later, before I close, make sure to subscribe the channel and please do private feedback if you want to hear about a particular topic or you want to present in the forum. We will meet again in a couple of weeks, and we will be talking about one of the interesting topic about migration. It will be from one of the product managers from Azure Cosmos DB. Yeah, until then, yeah, catch you again. Talk to you later. Bye.